Marcellus, 271 to 208 BC. Marcus Claudius, who 5 times held the office of consul of the Roman people, was the son of Marcus, and according to Posidonius, was the first of his family to be given the name of Marcellus, which means warlike. Much of his experience was concerned with the art of war, and he possessed a powerful arm and a vigorous body. Fighting appealed to his temperament, and he was a daring soldier who bore himself with lordly assurance on the battlefield, but in other respects, he was modest and humane. He had enough regard for Greek culture and literature to make him honor and admire those who excelled in them. But he himself never found the leisure to master or even study these subjects to the extent that he would have wished. For if ever there were men for whom, as Homer says, the gods decreed that from youth until ripe old age they should labor, fighting in arduous wars, they were the foremost Romans of his generation. In their youth they campaigned against the Carthaginians for the possession of Sicily. In their prime they fought the Gauls for the defense of Italy itself. And as veterans they found themselves matched once more against the Carthaginians, this time under Hannibal. In this way they never enjoyed the relief from active service which old age brings to most men. But because of their noble birth and their prowess in war, they were constantly summoned to take up new commands. Marcellus was a trained and expert soldier in every branch of fighting, but it was above all in single combat that he excelled. He never declined a challenge, and he killed every opponent who challenged him. In Sicily, he saved the life of his brother Ottocilius when he was in mortal danger by covering him with his shield and killing his attackers. For these exploits, he was awarded crowns and other decorations by his commanders, although he was still only a young man. And as his reputation increased, the people elected him to the office of curule aedile, and the priests chose him to be an augur. This is a branch of the priesthood to which the law assigns as one of its most important functions the observation and study of auguries, which arise from the flight of birds. While he was aedile, he was obliged to bring a disagreeable accusation before the Senate. He had a son, also named Marcus, who was just then in the flower of his youthful beauty, and who was admired by his fellow countrymen as much for his modesty and his exemplary upbringing as for his good looks. Marcellus's colleague, Capitolinus, a dissolute man, whose passions were as shameless as they were uncontrolled, tried to seduce him. The boy at first repelled his advances by himself, but when they were repeated, he confided in his father. Marcellus was furious and denounced the man before the Senate. Capitolinus tried by various shifts and evasions to quibble his way out of the charge, then appealed to the tribunes of the people, and finally, when they rejected his plea, flatly denied the accusation. As there had been no witnesses of his behavior, the Senate decided to send for the boy. When he appeared before them and they saw how he blushed and wept, and how his feelings of shame were mingled with an unquenchable indignation, they decided that no further proof was necessary, but immediately condemned Capitolinus and fined him. Marcellus used the money from the fine to commission some silver libation bowls and dedicated these to the gods. After the First Punic War had ended in its 22nd year, Rome once more found herself engaged in a struggle with the Gauls. The Insubrians were a Celtic people who inhabit the part of Italy which lies at the foot of the Alps. And although they were strong in numbers, they not only mobilized their own forces, but called in the help of the Gallic mercenaries, known as the Gassetae. It seemed to be a piece of miraculously good fortune for Rome that this Gallic war did not break out while the struggle with Carthage was still in progress, but that the Gauls, like a third competitor, sat on one side awaiting their turn and remained scrupulously inactive while the two nations fought each other, and then only stripped for action when the victors were ready to receive their challenge. But even so, the prospect of the war aroused the deepest fears among the Romans, partly because they would be engaging an enemy who lived so near their own frontiers and homes, and partly because of the traditional prestige of the Gauls, whom the Romans seemed to have feared more than any other enemy. The Romans never forgot that it was this people who had once captured their city. And afterwards they had passed a law that their priests should normally be exempt from military service, the exception being in the event of a fresh invasion by the Gauls. They gave further proof of their fears in their exceptional preparations for the war. For it is said that never before nor since were so many thousands of Romans called upon to bear arms at once. And also in the extraordinary sacrifices which they offered to the gods. The Romans do not practice any barbarous or outlandish rites, and in the humane sentiments which they cherish towards their divinities, they come nearer than any other people to the Greeks. Nevertheless, at the outbreak of this war, they felt obliged to follow out certain oracular instructions laid down in the Sibylline books, and to bury alive 2 Greeks, a man and a woman, and likewise 2 Gauls in the place known as the cattle market. And in accordance with these oracles, they still to this day, in the month of November, perform certain ceremonies which may not be spoken of nor witnessed by either Greeks or Gauls. The opening battles of this war brought great victories and also great disasters to the Romans. But none of these proved decisive until the 2 consuls, Flaminius and Furius, led a strong army against the Insubrians. But just as they set out, the river which flows through Picenum was seen to be running with blood. It was reported that 3 moons had been seen at the city of Ariminum, and at the same time the augurs, whose duty it was to observe the flight of birds during the consular elections, insisted that the omens had been inauspicious and hostile at the moment when the victorious candidates' names had been announced. Thereupon the Senate immediately had letters dispatched to the camp, in which they summoned the consuls to return to the city as quickly as possible to lay down their office, and forbade them to undertake any action against the enemies so long as they remained in authority. When these letters were delivered, Flaminius refused to open them until he had first engaged the barbarians, routed them in battle, and overrun their territory. For this reason, when he returned to Rome laden with great quantities of booty, the people would not go out to meet him. Instead, because he had not immediately complied with the order recalling him, but had disobeyed the letters and treated them with insolent contempt, the people came near to denying him the honor of a triumph. And as soon as he had celebrated it, they compelled both him and his colleague to lay down their consulship and reduced him to the rank of private citizen. Such were the scruples of the Romans in referring all their affairs to the will of the gods, nor would they tolerate the smallest oversight in the observation of omens and traditional rites, even if the omission were followed by the most brilliant successes. In short, they regarded it as more important for the safety of the state that their magistrates should honor religious observances than that they should defeat their enemies. As an example of this belief, I may quote the case of Tiberius Sempronius, a man whose reputation for courage and upright conduct was second to none in Rome, and who announced the names of Scipio Nasica and Gaius Marcius as his successors in the consulship. When these two men had already arrived in their provinces and taken up command of their armies, Sempronius came by chance upon a book which specified the various religious ceremonials, and discovered in it an instruction of which he had never even heard before. It was this: whenever a consul has hired a house or a tent outside the city walls for the purpose of sitting there and taking the auspices by observing the flight of birds, and he is obliged for any reason to return to the city before sure signs have appeared, he must give up the house which he originally hired and take another, and must begin all his observations afresh. Tiberius had apparently been unaware of this instruction, and had twice used the same house before, proclaiming as consuls the men whose names I have mentioned. When he discovered his error, he reported the matter to the Senate. The Senate decided that they could not treat even such a minor act of negligence lightly, but sent out letters to the consuls, who in turn immediately left their provinces, returned to Rome with all speed, and resigned their appointments. These events took place at a later date, but in the present instance, two priests of the noblest families were deprived of their offices. Cornelius Cethegus, because he failed to observe the proper procedure in presenting the entrails of a victim, and Quintus Sulpicius, because while he was sacrificing the peaked cap, which is worn by the priests who are known as flamines, had fallen off his head. Again, because of the squeak of a shrew mouse was heard at the moment when Minucius the dictator was appointing Gaius Flaminius as his master of horse. The people thereupon deprived both men of their positions and put others in their places. Yet although they were so scrupulous in observing these minute details, they did not indulge in any kind of superstition, because they never permitted any change or departure from their ancient rites. To return to our narrative, when Flaminius and his colleague Furius had resigned their offices, Marcellus was chosen as consul by the so-called interroges. And after taking up the office, he nominated Gnaeus Cornelius as his colleague. Now it has been alleged that although the Gauls put forward a number of conciliatory proposals, and although the Senate was in favor of concluding peace, Marcellus stirred up the people's indignation so as to persuade them to continue the war. In spite of this, it appears that a peace was made, and that the Gestae broke it when they crossed the Alps and stirred up the Insubrians. The Gestae mustered 30,000 men, while the Insubrians' numbers were even larger, and since they were now full of confidence in their strength, they immediately marched against Acre, a town which was situated to the north of the river Po. Having arrived in this region, their king Britomartis detached a force of 10,000 Geisate and proceeded to ravage the country in the neighborhood of the Po. When this news reached Marcellus, he left his colleague at Acere in command of all the heavy infantry and a third of the cavalry. Then taking with him the rest of the cavalry and 600 of the most agile of his light infantry, he marched day and night without a halt until he came up with the 10,000 Gesetae near Clastidium, a Gallic village which had submitted to Roman rule not long before. There was no time for him to rest or refresh his troops, since his arrival was quickly discovered by the barbarians. They felt nothing but contempt for his tiny force of infantry, and since they were Gauls, had no great opinion of the Roman cavalry. The Gauls are particularly formidable at fighting on horseback, and in fact they have the reputation of excelling in this arm above any other, while on this occasion they also greatly outnumbered Marcellus. Headed by their king and shouting blood-curdling threats at the tops of their voices, they immediately launched a furious charge, expecting to sweep the Romans away. But Marcellus was determined to prevent them from outflanking and encircling his small force. As he led his cavalry forward, he made them fan out, and so extended his wings into a thin line until he was almost in contact with the enemy. Then, just as he was turning to launch a charge, his horse, startled by the enemy's ferocious shouts, suddenly wheeled about and carried him to the rear. Marcellus was alarmed that this sight might be taken as a bad omen and create confusion among the Romans. So he at once reined his horse to the left and forced the animal to face the enemy. At the same time, he went through the movements of praying to the sun, as if it was for this purpose that he had wheeled his horse. For the Romans always turn in this way when they offer worship to the gods. Then just before he closed with the enemy, he is said to have vowed that he would sacrifice to Jupiter Feretrius the finest suit of armor to be found among the Gauls. It was now that the king of the Gauls first saw Marcellus. He guessed from his badges of rank that this was the Roman commander. And riding far out in front of his men, he made directly for him, shouting out a challenge and brandishing his lance. He stood out among the rest of the Gauls, not only for his size, but for his complete suit of armor, which was embossed with gold and silver and decorated with brilliant colors and elaborate designs, so that it glittered like lightning. As Marcellus glanced along the enemy's ranks, he thought that this was the finest armor of all, and concluded that it must be the offering which he had vowed to the gods. So he charged the Gaul and pierced his breastplate with his lance. The impetus of his horse hurled his opponent to the ground, still living, and a second and a third blow immediately dispatched him. Thereupon Marcellus leaped from his horse, and laying his hands on the dead man's armor, he gazed up to heaven and cried aloud, "Jupiter Feretrius, you who judge the great deeds of generals and captains in war and on the battlefield, I call upon you to witness that I, a Roman general and a consul, have killed with my own hand a general and a king, that I am the third Roman commander to do this, and that I dedicate to you the first and the finest of the spoils. I pray that you will grant us no less good fortune as we fight out the rest of this war." As he ended his prayer, the Roman cavalry charged and found themselves engaging not only the Gallic horsemen, but also their supporting infantry, who attacked them at the same time. But in the end, they won a victory which was as unparalleled as it was unexpected. Never before nor since, so we are told, had so few mounted troops overcome such a large combined force of cavalry and infantry. The Gauls lost the greater part of their army, and their weapons and baggage were captured, after which Marcellus returned to join his colleague, who was holding out with difficulty against another Gallic army in the neighborhood of their largest and most populous city. This was Mediolanum, which the Cisalpine Gauls regard as the capital of their country. And they defended it with such spirit that Cornelius found his army had become the besieged rather than the besiegers. However, when Marcellus arrived and the Gestae learned that their king had been defeated and killed, they retired to their own territory. Mediolanum was captured, and the Gauls surrendered the rest of their cities of their own accord, and offered their submission to the Romans. They were granted peace on equitable terms. The Senate decreed that only Marcellus should be granted a triumph. His procession produced a superb spectacle such as had seldom been seen in Rome, both for the splendor and riches of the spoils of war, and for the gigantic size of the prisoners. But the most unusual and impressive sight of all was that of the general himself, when he appeared to carry the barbarian king's armor as an offering to the god. He had cut the tall, straight trunk of a young oak tree, trimmed it into the shape of a trophy, and upon this he had fastened and hung the spoils, which each part of the armor arranged in its proper position. When the procession began to move, he took up the tree himself, mounted his 4-horse chariot, and in this way an image of victory, the finest and most glorious ever seen in his day, was borne in state through the city. His troops followed, clad in their most brilliant armor, and as they marched they sang odes composed for the occasion and paeans of victory in honor of the god and their general. In this way Marcellus traversed the city until he reached the temple of Jupiter Feretrius, where he dismounted and dedicated his offering. He was the third and up to our day the last Roman to achieve this feat. The first was Romulus, who offered up the spoils of Acron of Canaanum. The second was Cornelius Cossus, with the spoils of Tolumnius the Tuscan. After them, Marcellus with the spoils of Britomartis, king of the Gauls. And since Marcellus, no man, the god to whom the spoils were dedicated is called Jupiter Feretrius. Some people say that this surname is derived from the Feretron, or car in which the trophy was carried. The word is Greek, like many others which had at that time been absorbed into Latin. Others say that the epithet refers to Jupiter as the wielder of the thunderbolt, since ferere is the Latin word which means to strike. Another explanation is that the word is derived from a blow given to the enemy, because even down to the present day, when the Romans are pursuing their enemies, they encourage one another by shouting the word feri, meaning strike. The word for spoils in general is spolia, but these particular spoils are known as spolia opima. It has been pointed out, however, that Numa Pompilius in his commentaries mentions three categories of opima. He lays it down that those of the first degree are to be consecrated to Jupiter Feretrius, those of the second to Mars, and those of the third to Cernunnos. And also that the reward for the first is to be 300 asses, for the second 200, and for the third 100. However, the most generally accepted account is that only the spoils which rank as opima are those which are captured in a pitched battle before the fighting begins, when the general kills the opposing commander with his own hand. So much then for this subject. The Roman people were so overjoyed at this victory and at the ending of the war that they sent the Pythian Apollo at Delphi a golden bull as a thanks offering. They also presented a generous share of the spoils to the allied cities and sent many presents to Hero, the ruler of Syracuse, who was their friend and ally. After Hannibal had invaded Italy, Marcellus was sent to Sicily in command of a fleet. Then came the disastrous defeat at Cannae, in which thousands of Romans were killed and only a few saved their lives by fleeing to Canusium. Everyone expected that Hannibal would immediately march on the capital, now that he had destroyed the flower of the Roman army. At this point, Marcellus dispatched 1,500 men from his fleet to help to defend Rome. And then, under orders from the Senate, he went to Canusium, collected the soldiers who had taken refuge there, and made a sortie from their fortified camp to show Hannibal that he had no intention of abandoning the surrounding countryside. By this time, the Romans had lost the greater number of their generals and prominent men in battle, while Fabius Maximus, who had earned the highest reputation for his reliability and shrewdness of judgment, was blamed for his excessive caution and his anxiety to avoid losses at any cost, was attacked as mere cowardly passivity. The people regarded him as a general who was perfectly qualified to carry on a defensive campaign, but who could never move over to the offensive. They therefore turned to Marcellus, and in the hope of combining his boldness and energy with Fabius's caution and foresight, they sometimes elected both as consuls together, and sometimes sent out one as consul and the other as proconsul. Posidonius says that Fabius was called the shield and Marcellus the sword of Rome. And indeed, Hannibal himself declared that he feared Fabius as a schoolmaster and Marcellus as an opponent. The first prevented him from inflicting losses on the Romans, the second inflicted them on him. One of the first consequences of Hannibal's victory at Cannae was that his troops became overconfident and careless of their discipline. Scattered groups of men would leave their camp and roam the countryside in search of plunder, whereupon Marcellus would swoop down and cut off these stragglers, and in this way he gradually weakened the Carthaginian army. Secondly, he did much to relieve the situation of Neapolis and of Nola. In Neapolis, he strengthened the resolution of the citizens, who were already staunch allies of Rome by their own choice. Nola, on the other hand, he found in a far more unsettling state, since the Senate was unable either to control or to win over the people who wished to ally themselves with Hannibal. One of the leading citizens, who was prominent not only for his aristocratic birth, but also for his bravery in the field, was a man named Bontius. He had shown the greatest courage in fighting for the Romans at Cannae, where he had killed many Carthaginians, and when he was at last found among the heaps of the dead with his body riddled with barbs, Hannibal felt so much admiration for his gallantry that he not only released him without a ransom, but presented him with gifts of his own accord and entertained him as a personal friend. In return for this generous treatment, Bontius became one of Hannibal's most ardent supporters and proceeded to use all his influence to make the people revolt against Rome. Marcellus felt that it would be a crime to put to death a man of such brilliant achievements who have fought side by side with the Romans in their greatest battles. And in addition to his natural kindliness of manner, he possessed the knack of winning the confidence of men who are dedicated to the pursuit of honor. So one day when Bontius greeted him, he asked him who he was. Of course, Marcellus knew this perfectly well, but he wanted an excuse to strike up a conversation with him. Then when the man answered Lucius Bontius, Marcellus, pretending to be surprised and delighted, exclaimed, "What, are you the same Lucius Bontius who is more talked of in Rome than any other man who fought at Cannae? The only soldier, so they say, who did not abandon Paulus Aemilius the consul, but received in your own body most of the spears and arrows that were aimed at him." When Bontius answered that he was the man and showed Marcellus some of his scars, the general went on, "Well then, since you carry with you all these marks of your devotion to Rome, why did you not come to us at once? Do you think that we are slow to reward such courage in our friends? when even our enemies go out of their way to honor it. After paying Bontius these compliments, he embraced him, and soon afterwards presented him with a war horse and 500 silver drachmas. After this, Bontius became a staunch supporter and ally of Marcellus, and played an important part in tracking down and denouncing the activities of Hannibal's partisans. These were very numerous, and they organized a plot to seize the Roman baggage train as soon as the army marched out against the enemy. Marcellus therefore marshaled his troops inside the city, had the baggage placed near the various gates, and then issued a proclamation forbidding the citizens of Nola to approach the walls. In this way, he made sure that there were no armed men to be seen, and Hannibal was tricked into leading his troops up to the walls without first putting them into battle order, as he supposed that fighting was going on inside the city. At this moment, Marcellus ordered the gate behind which he was waiting to be thrown open. He had his best cavalry formations with him, and immediately launched them against the enemy. Soon after, his infantry sallied forth from another gate, and with loud shouts bore down upon the Carthaginians at the run. Finally, while Hannibal was regrouping his forces to meet these attacks, a third gate was flung open, and through this the remainder of the Roman army poured out and attacked the enemy on all sides. This unexpected onslaught threw the Carthaginians into confusion, and they put up only a weak resistance against the first attack because of the troops whom they could see in the distance bearing down upon them. Hannibal's troops were driven back to their camp with heavy losses, both in killed and wounded, the first occasion on which they had ever been put to flight by the Romans. It is said that more than 5,000 of them lost their lives against a bare 500 on the Roman side. Livy, however, does not consider that the Carthaginians suffered a major defeat in this battle, nor does he say that they lost so many men, but he confirms that the victory brought great prestige to Marcellus and had a wonderful effect in raising the spirits of the Romans after the disasters they had suffered. They could now feel that they were faced not by an invincible and irresistible enemy, but by one who was just as liable to suffer a defeat as themselves. It was for this reason that when one of the consuls was killed, the people called upon Marcellus to take his place. They did this even though he was absent from Rome at the time. And in spite of the wishes of the magistrates, they postponed the election until he could return from the army. When he arrived, he was elected consul by a unanimous vote. But it so happened that a peal of thunder was heard at the moment, and the augurs regarded this as an inauspicious omen. However, their fear of the people was such that they did not dare to oppose his election openly, and so Marcellus himself voluntarily resigned his office. But this did not mean that he laid down his military command. Instead, he was created proconsul, returned to Nola, and began to take action there against the party which had sided with the Carthaginians. When Hannibal hurried to Nola to rescue his supporters and tried to bring about a pitched battle, Marcellus refused to be drawn. But as soon as Hannibal had allowed the greater part of his force to disperse on various plundering raids, and was no longer expecting a battle. The Romans made a sortie and attacked him. Marcellus had armed his infantry with the long spears which are used in naval fighting, and had taught them to watch for their opportunity and hurl their weapons at the enemy from long range. As the Carthaginians were not trained in throwing the javelin and carried only short spears for hand-to-hand fighting, these tactics seem to have produced remarkable results. All the Carthaginians who were engaged in this battle with the Romans turned tail and fled at once. They lost 5,000 dead and 600 prisoners, while 4 of their elephants were killed and 2 captured alive. But the most significant event of all was that on the 3rd day after the battle, more than 300 Spanish and Numidian horsemen deserted to the Romans. This was the first time that Hannibal had ever experienced such a disaster, for although he commanded a barbarian army composed of many separate and diverse nationalities, he had succeeded year after year in preserving a spirit which united all the troops serving under him. Nevertheless, the men who deserted to the Romans remained completely loyal for the rest of the war, both to Marcellus and to the generals who succeeded him. In the following year, after Marcellus had been elected consul for the 3rd time, he sailed to Sicily. Hannibal's successes in Italy had encouraged the Carthaginians to make another attempt to recover the island, especially as the affairs of Syracuse had been thrown into confusion after the death of the tyrant Hieronymus. Indeed, the situation there had already compelled the Romans to dispatch an army under the praetor Appius Claudius. As soon as Marcellus had taken over the command of this force, great numbers of Romans, whose predicament I shall now describe, presented themselves at his camp to petition him. Of the Roman army which faced Hannibal at Cannae, some had fled from the battlefield, while so many had been taken prisoner that it was believed that the Romans did not have enough men left to defend the walls of the capital. Yet in spite of this, the citizens' resolve remained so firm and their spirits so unconquerable that although Hannibal offered to release his prisoners of war for a small ransom, the people voted against their return. Instead, they allowed some to be put to death and others to be sold into slavery outside Italy. As for the large number of survivors who had saved themselves by running away, they sent them to Sicily and forbade them to set foot again in Italy so long as the war against Hannibal lasted. These were the men who crowded around Marcellus as soon as he arrived, threw themselves at his feet, and implored him with tears and lamentations to admit them once more to honorable military service. They swore that they would prove by their actions that the defeat they had suffered had been caused by misfortune, not by cowardice. Marcellus took pity on them and wrote to the Senate asking for permission to enlist these men so as to make up the losses in his own army as they occurred. A lengthy debate followed, at the end of which the Senate's verdict was that the Romans did not need the services of cowards, but that if Marcellus nevertheless wished to employ them, they must not be awarded any of the usual honors or prizes for valor. This decree angered Marcellus, and when he returned to Rome after the end of the war in Sicily, he reproached the Senate because they had not allowed him, in consideration of his many great services, to rescue this large body of citizens from their wretched situation. But to return to the campaign in Sicily, Marcellus was first of all confronted with an outrage committed by Hippocrates, the commander of the Syracusans. This man, in order to secure the support of the Carthaginians and make himself tyrant, slaughtered many of the Romans living in Leontini. Whereupon Marcellus stormed and captured the city. He did no harm to the native inhabitants, but had all the deserters whom he captured flogged and beheaded. At this, Hippocrates first sent a report to Syracuse that Marcellus was massacring all the inhabitants of Leontini. And when this rumor had created a panic in the city, he suddenly attacked and captured it. Marcellus responded by moving his whole army up to Syracuse. He encamped close by and sent envoys into the city to give the people the true account of what had happened at Leontini. But this maneuver proved ineffective, and the Syracusans refused to listen to them, as Hippocrates and his supporters were now in control. Marcellus's next action was to attack the city by land and sea simultaneously, the land forces being commanded by Appius, while Marcellus directed a fleet of 60 quinqueremes, which were equipped with many different kinds of weapons and missiles. In addition, he had built a siege engine, which was mounted on a huge platform supported by 8 galleys lashed together. And with this, he sailed up to the city walls, confident that the size and the imposing spectacle of his armament together with his personal prestige would combine to overawe the Syracusans. But he had reckoned without Archimedes, and the Roman machines turned out to be insignificant, not only in the philosopher's estimation, but also by comparison with those which he had constructed himself. Archimedes did not regard his military inventions as an achievement of any importance, but merely as a byproduct which he occasionally pursued for his own amusement. Of his serious work, namely the study of geometry, he had done this in the past because Hero, the former ruler of Syracuse, had often pressed and finally persuaded him to divert his studies from the pursuit of abstract principles to the solution of practical problems, and to make his theories more intelligible to the majority of mankind by applying them through the medium of the senses to the needs of everyday life. It was Eudoxus and Archytas who were the originators of the now celebrated and highly prized art of mechanics. They used it with great ingenuity to illustrate geometrical theorems and to support by means of mechanical demonstration, easily grasped by the senses, proportions which are too intricate for proof by word or diagram. For example, to solve the problem of finding two mean proportional lines, which are necessary for the construction of many other geometrical figures, both mathematicians resorted to mechanical means and adapted to their purposes certain instruments named mesolabes, taken from conic sections. Plato was indignant at these developments and attacked both men for having corrupted and destroyed the ideal purity of geometry. He complained that they had caused her to forsake the realm of disembodied and abstract thought for that of material objects, and to employ instruments which required much base and manual labor. For this reason, mechanics came to be separated from geometry, and as the subject was for a long time disregarded by philosophers, it took its place among the military arts. However this may be, Archimedes, in writing to Hero, who was both a relative and a friend of his, asserted that with any given force it was possible to move any given weight, and then carried away with enthusiasm at the power of his demonstration, so we are told, went on to enlarge his claim and declared that if he were given another world to stand on, he could move the earth. Hero was amazed and invited him to put this theorem into practice and show him some great weight moved by a tiny force. Archimedes chose for this demonstration a three-masted merchantman of the royal fleet, which had been hauled ashore with immense labor by a large gang of men, and he proceeded to have the ship loaded with her usual freight and embarked a large number of passengers. He then seated himself at some distance away and without using any noticeable force but merely exerting traction with his hand through a complex system of pulleys, he drew the vessel towards him with as smooth and even a motion as if she were gliding through the water. The king was deeply impressed, and recognizing the potentialities of his skill, he persuaded Archimedes to construct for him a number of engines designed both for attack and defense, which could be employed in any kind of siege warfare. Hero himself never had occasion to use these, since most of his life was spent at peace amid festivals and public ceremonies. But when the present war broke out, the apparatus was ready for the Syracusans to use, and its inventor was at hand to direct its employment. When the Romans first attacked by sea and land, the Syracusans were struck dumb with terror and believed that nothing could resist the onslaught of such powerful forces. But presently Archimedes brought his engines to bear and launched a tremendous barrage against the Roman army. This consisted of a variety of missiles, including a great volley of stones, which descended upon their target with an incredible noise and velocity. There was no protection against this artillery, and the soldiers were knocked down in swaths and their ranks thrown into confusion. At the same time, huge beams were run out from the walls so as to project over the Roman ships. Some of them were then sunk by great weights dropped from above, while others were seized at the bows by iron chains or by beaks like those of cranes, hauled into the air by means of counterweights until they stood upright upon their sterns, and then allowed to plunge to the bottom, or else they were spun round by means of windlasses situated inside the city and dashed against the steep cliffs and rocks which jutted out under the walls, with great loss of life to the crews. Often there would be seen the terrifying spectacle of a ship being lifted clean out of the water into the air and whirled about as it hung there, until every man had been shaken out of the hull and thrown in different directions, after which it would be dashed down empty upon the walls. As for the enormous siege engine, which Marcellus brought up, mounted on 8 galleys, as I have described, and known as a sambuca because of its resemblance to the musical instrument of that name, a stone weighing 100 pounds was discharged while it was still approaching the city wall, immediately followed by a second and a third. These descended on their target with a thunderous crash, and a great surge of water shattered the platform on which the machine was mounted, loosened the bolts which held it together, and dislodged the whole framework from the hulks which supported it. Marcellus, finding his plan of attack thus brought to a standstill, drew off his ships as quickly as possible and ordered his land forces to retire. After this, he held a council of war and formed a new plan. to move up as closely as possible to the walls under cover of darkness. The Romans calculated that the cables which Archimedes used for his siege engines imparted such a tremendous velocity to the missiles they discharged that these would go flying over their heads, but that at close quarters where a low trajectory was required, they would be ineffective. However, Archimedes, it seems, had long ago foreseen such a possibility and had designed engines which were suitable for any distance and missiles to match them. He had a large number of loopholes made in the walls, and in these he placed short-range weapons known as scorpions, which were invisible to the attacker, but could be discharged as soon as he arrived at close quarters. So when the Romans crept up close to the walls expecting to surprise the enemy, they were again greeted by a hail of missiles. Huge stones were dropped on them almost perpendicularly, and it seemed as if they were faced by a curtain of darts along the whole length of the wall, so that the attackers soon fell back. But here too, even while they were hurrying, as they hoped, out of danger, they came under fire from the medium-range catapults, which caused heavy losses among them. At the same time, many of their ships were dashed against one another, and all this while they were helpless to retaliate. Archimedes had mounted most of his weapons under the cover of the city walls, and the Romans began to believe that they were fighting against a supernatural enemy, as they found themselves constantly struck down by his opponents whom they could never see. Marcellus, however, escaped unhurt from this assault and afterwards made fun of his own siege experts and engineers. "We may as well give up fighting this geometrical Briareus," he said, "who uses our ships like cups to ladle water out of the sea, who has whipped our Sambuca and driven it off in disgrace, and who can outdo the 100-handed giants of mythology in hurling so many different missiles at us at once." For the truth was that all the rest of the Syracusans merely provided the manpower to operate Archimedes' inventions, and it was his mind which directed and controlled every maneuver. All other weapons were discarded, and it was upon his alone that the city relied both for attack and defense. At last the Romans were reduced to such a state of alarm that if they saw so much as a length of rope or a piece of timber appear over the top of the wall, it was enough to make them cry out, "Look, Archimedes is aiming one of his machines at us," and they would turn their backs and run. When Marcellus saw this, he abandoned all attempts to capture the city by assault and settled down to reduce it by blockade. As for Archimedes, he was a man who possessed such exalted ideals, such profound spiritual wisdom, and such a wealth of scientific knowledge that, although his inventions had earned him a reputation for almost superhuman intellectual power, he would not deign to leave behind him any writings on his mechanical discoveries. He regarded the business of engineering, and indeed of every art which ministers to the material needs of life, as an ignoble and sordid activity, and he concentrated his ambition exclusively upon those speculations whose beauty and subtlety are untainted by the claims of necessity. These studies, he believed, are incomparably superior to any others, since here the grandeur and beauty of the subject matter vie for our admiration with the cogency and precision of the methods of proof. Certainly, in the whole science of geometry, it is impossible to find more difficult and intricate problems handled in simpler and purer terms than in his works. Some writers attribute this to his natural genius. Others maintain that a phenomenal industry lay behind the apparently effortless ease with which he obtained his results. The fact is that no amount of mental effort of his own would enable a man to hit upon the proof of one of Archimedes' theorems. And yet, as soon as it is explained to him, he feels that he might have discovered it himself. So smooth and rapid is the path by which he leads us to the required conclusion. So it is not at all difficult to credit some of the stories which have been told about him, of how, for example, he often seemed so bewitched by the song of some inner and familiar siren that he would forget to eat his food or take care of his person, or how when he was carried by force, as he often was, to the bath, for his body to be washed and anointed, he would trace geometrical figures in the ashes and draw diagrams with his finger in the oil which had been rubbed over his skin. Such was the rapture which his work inspired in him, so as to make him truly the captive of the muses. And although he was responsible for many discoveries of great value, he is said to have asked his friends and relatives to place on his tomb after his death nothing more than the shape of a cylinder enclosing a sphere, with an inscription explaining the ratio by which the containing solid exceeds the contained. Such was Archimedes' character, and in so far as it rested with him, he kept himself and his city unconquered. But while Syracuse was being blockaded, Marcellus did not remain idle. He captured Megara, one of the most ancient of the Greek settlements in Sicily, and he also stormed Hippocrates' camp at Aquileia and killed more than 8,000 of his men, launching his attacks while the enemy were still digging their entrenchments. Besides this, he overran a large part of Sicily, persuaded a number of cities to revolt from the Carthaginians, and defeated his opponents wherever he encountered resistance. Some while afterwards, he captured a man named Damopus, a Spartan who had attempted to escape from Syracuse by ship. The Syracusans were anxious to ransom him, and during the numerous meetings and negotiations that followed, Marcellus noticed a particular tower which was carelessly guarded and into which he could infiltrate men unobserved, since the wall in its immediate vicinity was easy to climb. During his visits to parley with the Syracusans, he had the height of the tower carefully measured and scaling ladders prepared. Marcellus chose a moment when the Syracusans were celebrating a feast day in honor of Artemis and had given themselves up to drinking and other festivities before they knew what he was about. He had not only seized the tower but also occupied the adjacent wall with his troops and forced his way through the hexapila, the gate at the northwest corner of the city. When the citizens discovered what had happened, and while they were running to and fro in confusion and attempting to muster their forces, Marcellus ordered his trumpets to be sounded from all sides at once. The Syracusans fled from the sound in terror and imagined that the whole city had already been captured. But in fact, they still held Acradina, which is the largest, handsomest, and most strongly defended quarter, because it had been fortified on the landward side, where it adjoins the other districts of the city, the northern part of which is known as Neapolis, and the southern as Tyche. When these districts had been captured, Marcellus made his entry at daybreak through the hexapila, amid the congratulations of his officers. It is said that as he looked down from the heights upon the great and magnificent city below, he wept as he thought of its impending fate and of how its appearance would be transformed in a few hours' time when his army had sacked it. For his troops had demanded their plunder, and not one of his officers dared to resist them. Indeed, many of them had urged that they should set fire to the city and raze it to the ground. Marcellus refused to tolerate this suggestion, but much against his will he allowed his men to carry off property and slaves. However, he gave strict orders that they must not lay a hand on free citizens, nor kill, outrage, or enslave any Syracusan. And yet, in spite of having shown such moderation, he felt that the city had been subjected to a pitiable fate, and even in the moment of triumph, he was filled with sorrow and compassion as he saw the brilliant prosperity of so many generations being swept away in a few short hours. It is said that as much wealth was carried away from Syracuse as at a later date from Carthage. Not long afterwards, the rest of the city was captured by treachery and given over to plunder, except for their royal property, which was handed over to the Roman treasury. But what distressed Marcellus most of all was the death of Archimedes. As fate would have it, the philosopher was by himself, engrossed in working out some calculation by means of a diagram, and his eyes and his thoughts were so intent upon the problem that he was completely unaware that the Romans had broken through the defenses, or that the city had been captured. Suddenly a soldier came upon him and ordered him to accompany him to Marcellus. Archimedes refused to move until he had worked out his problem and established his demonstration, whereupon the soldier flew into a rage, drew his sword, and killed him. According to another account, the Roman came up with a drawn sword and threatened to kill him there and then. When Archimedes saw him, he begged him to stay his hand for a moment, so that he should not leave his theorem imperfect and without its demonstration. But the soldier paid no attention and dispatched him at once. There is yet a third story to the effect that Archimedes was on his way to Marcellus, bringing some of his instruments, such as sundials and spheres and quadrants, which the help of which the dimensions of the sun could be measured by the naked eye. When some soldiers met him, and believing that he was carrying gold in the box, promptly killed him. At any rate, it is generally agreed that Marcellus was deeply affected by his death, that he abhorred the man who had killed him as if he had committed an act of sacrilege, and that he sought out Archimedes' relatives and treated them with honor. The Romans were regarded by other peoples as masters of the art of war and formidable adversaries on the battlefield, but they had so far given little indication that they could show kindness or humanity, or the civil virtues in general, and Marcellus seems to have been the first to demonstrate to the Greeks that the Romans possessed a stronger sense of justice than they themselves. He behaved with such fairness to all who came into contact with him, and conferred so many benefits both upon cities and private individuals, that if the peoples of Enna or Megara or Syracuse were subjected to any harsh treatment, it was generally believed that the fault for this lay with the vanquished rather than the victors. Here I will quote one example out of many. There is a Sicilian town named Engion, which is of no great size but is very ancient, and is celebrated because of the appearance there of the goddesses who are known as mothers. Tradition has it that the local temple was built by Cretans, and the people used to keep on show there a number of spears and bronze helmets. some of them inscribed with the name of Meriones, and others with that of Odysseus, who are reputed to have dedicated these to the goddesses. The people were ardent supporters of the Carthaginians, but their most prominent citizen, whose name was Nicias, did his utmost to persuade them to go over to the Romans, arguing his case in bold and outspoken language in the public assembly and attacking his opponent's policy as unsound. His enemies became alarmed at his growing influence and prestige and planned to kidnap him and hand him over to the Carthaginians. Nicias soon became aware of their plot and of the fact that he was being secretly watched, and so he purposely let fall in public a number of irreverent references to the mothers, and went out of his way to show that he could neither believe in the generally accepted legend about their appearances nor even respect it. This action delighted his enemies, since he seemed to be providing them with excellent grounds for the punishment they had in store for him. But just as they had completed their preparations to seize him, a public assembly was held, and during the debate, while Nicias was actually offering some advice to the people, he suddenly threw himself to the ground. Then, after waiting for a few moments amid the silence and astonishment which naturally followed this action, he raised his head, turned it about, and began to speak in a low and trembling tone, which little by little he made shriller and more intense. Finally, when he saw that the whole assembly had been struck dumb with horror, he threw off his cloak, tore open his tunic, and leaping up half naked, rushed towards the exit of the theater, crying out that he was pursued by the mothers. So strong was his fellow citizens' awe of the gods that not one of them dared to lay a hand on him or stand in his path. Instead, everyone made way for him as he dashed to the city gates, imitating as he ran the shrieks and gestures that might be expected of a man who was possessed and out of his wits. At the same time, his wife, who had been let into the secret and was helping him play his part, took her children with her and prostrated herself as a suppliant before the shrines of the goddesses. Then, under pretense of looking for her husband as he wandered about the countryside, she made her way safely out of the city without any hindrance. And in this way they all escaped to Marcellus's camp at Syracuse. The leading men of Engium went on to insult the Romans and commit various acts of hostility against them. And at length Marcellus captured the town, had them put in chains, and was about to execute them. At this point, Nicias, who was standing by, burst into tears and, clasping Marcellus's hands and knees, pleaded with him to spare the lives of his fellow countrymen. Beginning with his enemies, Marcellus relented, set them all free, and refrained from punishing their city, while he also presented Nicias with a large estate and a number of gifts. At least this is the story which we have from Posidonius the philosopher. When the Romans recalled Marcellus to carry on the war against Hannibal in Italy, he took back with him most of the statues and other offerings which the Syracusans had dedicated to the gods, including their finest works of art, for he intended that these should not only decorate his triumph, but also adorn the capital. Before this date, Rome neither possessed nor indeed was even aware of such elegant and exquisite creations, nor was there any taste for a graceful and delicate art of this kind. Instead, the city was filled with the blood-stained arms and spoils of barbarian tribes, and crowned with the monuments and trophies of victorious campaigns. so that to the unwarlike visitor, or as that she offered almost nothing to gladden or reassure the eye. Indeed, just as Epaminondas speaks of the Bacodian plain as a dancing floor of Ares, and Xenophon refers to Ephesus as an arsenal of war, so it seems to me that one might have summed up Rome of those days in Pindar's phrase as a sanctuary of Ares who revels in war. At any rate, Marcellus greatly pleased the common people because he adorned this capital with works of art which possessed the Hellenic grace and charm and truth to nature. On the other hand, it was Fabius Maximus who earned the approval of the older generation, because after he had captured Tarentum, he neither disturbed nor removed a single monument of this kind. He carried off all the money and valuables which had belonged to the city, but allowed the statues to remain in their places, and on this occasion made the remark which has since become famous: "Let us leave the Tarentines, these angry gods of theirs." Such people blamed Marcellus in the first place for bringing discredit upon the name of Rome, because he paraded not only men but gods like captives in his triumphal procession, and secondly because hitherto the people had been accustomed to spend their time either in fighting or in agriculture, and had never tasted luxury or leisure, so that their character had been, as Euripides describes that of Hercules, rough and unpolished, but great on great occasions. Now, on the contrary, he was teaching them to become lazy and glib connoisseurs of art and artists, so that they idled away the greater part of the day in clever and trivial chatter about aesthetics. In spite of such criticisms, Marcellus spoke with pride of what he had done, and he liked to claim even to the Greeks that he had taught the ignorant Romans to admire and honor the glories of Greek art. Marcellus's enemies opposed the granting of a triumph to him on the grounds that the campaign in Sicily was not yet finished, and that a third triumph would arouse undue envy. The general therefore gave way of his own free will and agreed to lead the main procession to the Alban Mount, and to enter the city only with the minor ceremony, which the Greeks call an Eva, and the Romans an Ovatio. The general who leads this does not ride in a four-horse chariot, heralded by trumpets and wearing a crown of laurel, as happens in a major triumph, but walks in the procession in shoes, escorted by a large company of flute players, and wearing a crown of myrtles, so that his appearance is peaceable and friendly rather than menacing. This is a clear proof, it seems to me, that in ancient times it was not so much the importance of a general's achievement as the manner in which he had accomplished it, which decided whether a major triumph or innovation was granted him. Those who had conquered by fighting a battle and killing their enemies entered this city with the martial and awe-inspiring pomp of the formal triumph, after crowning their men and their weapons with abundant wreaths of laurel, as was also the custom whenever they purified the army with lustral rites. On the other hand, the generals who had had no occasion to appeal to arms, but had brought everything to a successful issue by means of diplomacy, persuasion, and negotiation, were granted by the law the honor of conducting this peaceful and festive procession in the manner of a paean of thanksgiving. For the flute is an instrument of peace, and the myrtle is beloved of Aphrodite, who of all the gods and goddesses is the most averse to violence and war. The name of Ova for this minor triumph is not derived from the Greek avasmos, as is generally supposed. For the major triumph is also accompanied by songs and cries of Eva. But the word has been twisted by the Greeks into a form that bears a meaning in their language, because they are convinced that the ceremony is also partly intended to honor Dionysus, among whose names are those of Evius and Thriambos. The true explanation, however, is a different one, namely that it was customary for the general, if taking part in the major triumph, to sacrifice an ox, and if in the minor a sheep. Now the Latin for sheep is ovis, and this is why the minor triumph is called ova. It is also worth mentioning here that the instructions laid down by the lawgiver of Sparta are exactly the opposite of those observed by the Romans. In Sparta, the returning general, if he had overcome the enemy by deception or persuasion, sacrificed an ox, and if by force of arms, a cock. For although the Spartans were the most warlike of peoples, they believed that an exploit achieved by means of argument and intelligence was greater and more worthy of a human being than one effected by mere force and courage. As to which of these opinions is to be preferred, I leave it to the reader to decide. While Marcellus was serving his fourth term as consul, his enemies persuaded the Syracusans to come to Rome, lay accusations against him, and denounce him before the Senate for having perpetrated terrible injustices contrary to the terms of their surrender. It so happened that when they arrived, Marcellus was engaged in performing a sacrifice on the Capitol, but as the Senate was still sitting, the Syracusans immediately presented themselves before it and begged that their grievances might be heard and justice granted them. Marcellus's fellow consul was indignant that his colleagues should be accused in his absence, and tried to have them ejected from the chamber. But as soon as Marcellus heard of their arrival, he hurried to the Senate house. Then, seating himself as consul in his curule chair, he began to dispatch the regular business of the day. When this was finished, he came down from his chair, and taking his stand as a private citizen, in the place where those who had been put on trial customarily offered their defense, he called upon the Syracusans to press their charges. The dignity and assurance of his manner thoroughly disconcerted them, and they were abashed to find that the man who had been irresistible in the field was still more formidable and unassailable in his consular robe of purple. But at length, with the encouragement of Marcellus's opponents, they began their impeachment and urged their plea for justice, in the course of which they indulged in much lamentation for the fate of their city. The substance of their complaint was that, in spite of their being friends and allies of the Roman people, they had suffered harsher treatment at Marcellus's hands than that which other generals had meted out even to conquered enemies. Marcellus retorted that they had committed many hostile acts against the Romans, for which they had received no punishment whatsoever, except for the kind of damage from which it is impossible to protect a population when a city is taken by storm. The fact that their city had been captured, he added, was due to their own willful refusal of his repeated offers of terms. They certainly could not plead that they had been forced into war by tyrannical rulers, for they had themselves elected these very rulers with the object of going to war. After both sides had been heard, and the Syracusans, according to the usual custom, had withdrawn, Marcellus handed over the presidency of the Senate to his colleague, left the chamber with his accusers, and stood outside the doors. His appearance remained perfectly normal and showed not a trace of apprehension for the verdict nor of anger against the Syracusans. He simply waited with the utmost serenity and self-control to hear the outcome of the case. When the votes had been cast and he was declared not guilty, the Syracusans threw themselves at his feet. They implored him with tears in their eyes to put away his anger against the delegates before him, and to take pity on the rest of this city, which never forgot a kindness, and would henceforth be eternally grateful to him. Marcellus was moved by this appeal. He pardoned the envoys and thereafter became a constant benefactor to their city. He had already restored to them their freedom, the right to be governed by their own laws, and what remained of their property, and these concessions were confirmed by the Senate. In return, the people conferred many of their highest honors upon him, and in particular they passed a law that whenever Marcellus or any of his descendants should land in Sicily, the Syracusans would wear garlands and offer sacrifices to the gods. Soon after this, he again took the field against Hannibal. Ever since the defeat at Cannae, the other consuls and generals had relied almost without exception upon the strategy of avoiding an engagement at all costs. And certainly none had the courage to risk a pitched battle with the enemy. Marcellus, however, chose precisely the opposite course, because he was convinced that long before the period allowed for wearing down Hannibal's strength had elapsed, Italy herself would have bled to death. He believed too that Fabius, by constantly insisting upon safety at all costs, was pursuing the wrong method to heal his country's affliction. The danger was that Rome was already drooping under her burdens, and that if they continued to wait as he proposed, the end of the war might well coincide with her total collapse. Fabius, as he saw it, was like one of those timid physicians who shrink from applying drastic remedies and imagine that a disease has subsided when it is really the patient's powers of resistance which have been exhausted. Accordingly, his first move was to regain control of the principal Samnite cities which had revolted. There he found large sums of money and stocks of grain, and he also captured the Carthaginian detachments, amounting to 3,000 soldiers, whom Hannibal had stationed to defend them. Next, after Hannibal had defeated and killed the proconsul Gnaeus Fulvius in Apulia, together with 11 military tribunes, and had cut to pieces the greater part of his army, Marcellus sent letters to Rome telling the citizens to take heart, since he was already on the march, and would see to it that Hannibal's triumph was short-lived. Livy remarks that when these letters were read, they did not do much to reassure the Romans, but rather increased their alarm. They reflected that the risk which lay ahead of them was even greater than the defeat they had just suffered, in proportion as Marcellus was a better general than Fulvius. However, Marcellus, according to his promise, at once marched after Hannibal and made contact with him in Lucania. There he found him entrenched in a strong position on high ground, near the city of Numistro, and so he encamped in the plain. On the following day, Marcellus was the first to draw up his troops in battle order, and a great battle ensued, which, although desperately contested, remained indecisive. The fighting began at 9 o'clock in the morning and was only broken off with difficulty after nightfall. But at daybreak, Marcellus once more led out his army, formed up his men amid the heaps of dead, and challenged Hannibal to fight again to decide the victory. This time Hannibal declined battle, whereupon Marcellus, after stripping the enemy's dead and burying his own, continued to pursue the Carthaginians. He won the highest admiration for his skill in this campaign, because although Hannibal repeatedly set ambushes for him, Marcellus escaped every one and had the better of their skirmishing encounters. For this reason, when the time for the consular elections approached, the Senate decided that it was advisable to summon the other consul from Sicily rather than to recall Marcellus. At the moment when he was grappling with Hannibal, when the consul arrived, the Senate instructed him to declare Quintus Fulvius dictator. The reason for this procedure was that a dictator cannot be chosen either by the people or by the Senate. Instead, one of the consuls or praetors appears before the assembled people and nominates the man who he himself has selected. This is the derivation of the word dictator, for the verb decere in Latin signifies to name or declare. Some writers, however, maintain that the dictator is so called because he does not put any question to the vote or to a show of hands, but issues his decrees and pronouncements on his own authority and according to his own judgment. And it is noteworthy that the orders of magistrates, which the Greeks call diatagmata, are called by the Romans edicta. However, when Marcellus's colleague arrived from Sicily, he wished to nominate a candidate other than Fulvius as dictator, and in order to avoid being forced to act against his own judgment, he sailed back to Sicily by night. In this situation, Quintus Fulvius was nominated as dictator by the people, and the Senate wrote to Marcellus requesting him to support this measure. He did so, proclaimed Quintus Fulvius dictator, and in this way confirmed the people's choice, while he himself was elected proconsul for the following year. Then, after conferring with Fabius Maximus, it was agreed that while Fabius should besiege Tarentum, Marcellus should follow Hannibal closely, divert his attention, and prevent him from making any move to relieve the city. Accordingly, he set out and came up with the Carthaginians at Canusium. Although Hannibal constantly shifted his camp and avoided a battle, Marcellus never lost contact with him, and at last attacked him when he had encamped, and by harassing him with skirmishes, succeeded in drawing him out of his entrenchments. Hannibal advanced, and Marcellus received his attack, but nightfall put an end to the fighting. The next morning Marcellus again took the field, and formed up his troops in battle order. At this, Hannibal, in great anxiety, called the Carthaginians together and appealed to them to fight as they had never done before. You see, he told them that even after all the great victories we have won, we shall not be able to breathe in peace or enjoy the leisure we have earned by our superiority in arms until we have driven this fellow away. After this, the two armies met, and during the fighting, Marcellus seems to have made an ill-judged maneuver which cost him the battle. He found his right wing hard-pressed and ordered one of his legions to advance to the front to support it, but this change of formation threw his ranks into confusion and allowed the enemy to carry off the victory, the Romans losing 2,700 men. Marcellus then withdrew his troops into his fortified camp, called them together, and reprimanded them, telling them that he could see many Roman weapons and bodies, but not a single Roman worthy of the name. They asked his pardon, whereupon he said that he could not give this when they had been driven off the field, but only after they had made themselves masters of it. However, he assured them that he would fight again on the next day, so that the first news to reach Rome would be of their victory, not of their rout. As he dismissed the troops, he gave orders that the cohorts which had been defeated should be issued with rations of barley instead of wheat. His words made so deep an impression that although many of his soldiers had suffered painful and dangerous wounds in the fighting, it is said that every man in the army felt Marcellus's reproaches more keenly than his own hurts. At daybreak, Marcellus had the scarlet tunic hung out, which is the usual signal for offering battle. At their own request, the disgraced units were posted in the front of the line, and the military tribunes led out the rest of the army and deployed it in battle order. When Hannibal learned this, he exclaimed, "Hercules, what do we do with a man who refuses to accept either good fortune or bad? This is the only general who gives his enemy no rest when he is victorious, nor takes any himself when he is defeated. We shall never have done with fighting him, it seems, because he attacks out of confidence when he is winning and out of shame when he is beaten." Then the two armies engaged, and when Hannibal saw that the issue was evenly balanced, he gave orders for his elephants to be brought up to the front and launched against the Roman line. The shock of their charge broke up the formation of the front ranks and caused great disorder. But one of the military tribunes snatched up a standard and, facing the elephants, struck the leading beast with the iron spike and forced it to wheel about. The elephant collided with the animal immediately behind and threw it and the rest of the column into confusion. Marcellus saw this and at once ordered his cavalry to charge at full speed into the struggling mass, so as to increase the enemy's disorder. The cavalry made a brilliant charge and pursued the retreating Carthaginians, cutting them down until they reached their own camp. But it was the plunging of their dying and wounded elephants which caused the greatest slaughter among the enemy. More than 8,000 Carthaginians are said to have lost their lives, while of the Roman force 3,000 were killed, and almost all the survivors wounded. It was this fact which allowed Hannibal to break camp during the night and put a long distance between himself and the Romans. Marcellus was unable to pursue him because of the large numbers of his own wounded, and he later withdrew at a leisurely pace into Campania and spent the summer in Sinuessa, allowing his soldiers to regain their strength. Hannibal, on the other hand, now that he had disengaged himself from Marcellus, felt confident enough to let his troops roam as freely as if they were disbanded, and he sent them raiding, plundering, and burning throughout the length and breadth of Italy. Meanwhile, Marcellus had fallen into disfavor at Rome, and his enemies persuaded Publicius Bibulus, one of the tribunes of the people, a clever speaker and a violent party politician, to bring an accusation against him. This man frequently harangued the assembly and tried to persuade them to hand over the command of Marcellus's army to another general. Marcellus, he said, exchanged a few passes with the enemy, but now he has left the arena and retired to the hot baths to refresh himself. When he heard of this, Marcellus left his legates in charge of the army and traveled to Rome to answer the slanders brought against him and defend his good name. There he found that an indictment based on these calumnies had already been drawn up. A day was appointed for the trial, and after the people had assembled in the Circus Flaminius, Bibulus rose and delivered his impeachment. Marcellus's own defense was short and simple, but a number of the most prominent and distinguished Romans paid glowing tributes to his generalship and upheld his actions in the most outspoken terms. They reminded the people that if they condemned Marcellus for cowardice, they would prove themselves to be far worse judges than Hannibal, for Marcellus was the one general whom the Carthaginian always sought to avoid. In fact, he employed every trick he knew to elude him and engage the others. These speeches had such an effect that Bibulus's hopes were completely frustrated, and in the end Marcellus was not only acquitted of the charges against him, but was actually elected consul for the 5th time. As soon as he had taken up his office, he succeeded in bringing under control a dangerous situation in Etruria, where the people were on the verge of revolt. And he then visited and pacified the cities of the region. After this, he wished to dedicate to glory and to valor a temple which he had built out of the spoils he had captured in Sicily. But this scheme was frustrated by the priests, who refused to agree to a single temple's being occupied by 2 deities. Marcellus was vexed by the priests' opposition, but he regarded it as an ominous sign, and so began to build another temple adjoining the first. And indeed that year was filled with prodigies, which caused him anxiety. Several temples were struck by lightning, and the gold offerings in the shrine of Jupiter were gnawed by mice. There were also reports that an ox had uttered human speech, and that a boy had been born with an elephant's head. And worse still, when various rites and sacrifices were performed to expiate these prodigies, the seers encountered unfavorable omens and therefore kept him in Rome, although he chafed at inaction, and was fretting to be gone, for no man was ever so consumed by a single passion to match himself against Hannibal in a decisive battle. His one dream by night, his single topic of discussion with his friends and colleagues, and his sole prayer to the gods was that he might meet Hannibal fairly in the field. I truly believe that his heart's desire would have been to have the 2 armies surrounded by a wall or a rampart where they could fight out the issue. And but for the fact that he was already loaded with honors and had given ample proof that in respect of good sense and maturity of judgment, he could stand comparison with any general in history, I should have said that he had fallen a victim to a boyish obsession, which was quite out of keeping with his years. For by the time that he entered upon his 5th consulship, he had already passed the age of 60. However, when at last the sacrifices and rites of purification recommended by the soothsayers have been performed, he took the field with his colleague and set himself to harass Hannibal's army in its camp between Bontia and Venusia, trying by every possible means to bring his opponent to battle. Hannibal refused to be drawn, but when he learned that the Romans had detached the force to attack the Epizephyrian Locrians, he laid an ambush in the hills near Petelia and killed 2,500 of their men. This action filled Marcellus with an overwhelming desire to get to grips with the enemy, and he moved his forces still closer to which appeared to offer a useful point of vantage, and was thickly covered with trees and shrubs. Its slopes provided lookout posts which commanded a view of both camps, and streams could be seen flowing down the sides. The Romans were astonished that Hannibal, who had the first choice of such a strong natural position, had not occupied it, but had left it for the enemy. It appears that in fact he did consider it a good site for a camp, but an even better one for an ambush. And it was for this purpose that he chose to use it. He concealed a force of javelin throwers and spearmen among the woods and hollows, as he felt certain that the Romans would be allured to the place because of its obvious natural advantages. And in the event, his calculations were exactly fulfilled. In their camp, the Romans immediately began to talk about the necessity of occupying the feature, and they enlarged on the advantages they would gain over their enemies by encamping on it, or at the very least by fortifying it. Accordingly, Marcellus decided to ride forward with a few horsemen and reconnoiter the site. But before doing this, he sent for his soothsayer and offered up a sacrifice. And when the first victim had been killed, the soothsayer showed him that its liver had no head. When he sacrificed for the second time, the head of the liver turned out to be unusually large, while all the other indications appeared exceptionally auspicious. And this seemed to dispel the misgivings aroused by the first offering. However, the soothsayers declared that this sequence of events disturbed them even more, because when unusually forbidding or threatening omens are immediately followed by others, which are exceptionally favorable, the unexpectedness of the change is in itself a matter for suspicion. But since, in Pindar's words, not fire, not walls of iron can hinder fate, Marcellus rode out, taking with him his colleague Crispinus, his son, who was a military tribune, and 220 horsemen in all. None of these, as it happened, was a Roman. They were all Etruscans, with the exception of 40 men of Fregellae, who had given Marcellus many proofs of their loyalty and courage. On the crest of the hill, which was thickly wooded, the enemy had posted a lookout. He could not be seen by the Romans, but could observe every movement in their camp. This man signaled the approach of the reconnoitering party to the troops who were hiding in ambush, and they allowed Marcellus to ride close up to them. Then, all of a sudden, they sprang to their feet, surrounded his party, flung their javelins, stabbed with their spears, pursued those who ran away, and fell upon those who stood their ground. These were the 40 men of Fregellae, who after the Etruscans had galloped off at the first onslaught, rallied round the two consuls and fought to defend them. Finally, Crispinus, who had been hit by 2 javelins, wheeled his horse and fled, while Marcellus was run through the side with a broad-bladed spear, the Latin name for which is lancia. Then the few survivors among the Fregellans left Marcellus lying where he had fallen, rescued his son who had been wounded, and made their escape back to the camp. In this skirmish there were hardly more than 40 men killed, but 5 lictors and 18 horsemen were taken prisoner, and Crispinus died of his wounds a few days later. To have lost both their consuls in a single action was a disaster without a parallel in the whole of Roman history. Hannibal took little interest in the fate of the other soldiers, but when he heard that Marcellus had been killed, he immediately hurried to the spot and stood for a long time by the dead body, admiring its strength and beauty. He uttered not a single boastful word, nor did he show any sign of exultation, such as might be expected of a man who has just rid himself of a bitter and formidable enemy. But after he had expressed his wonder at the unexpectedness of Marcellus's death, he removed his signet ring, but gave orders that his body should be treated with honor, wrapped in a fine robe, adorned and burned. After this, he collected the ashes in a silver urn, crowned it with a gilded wreath, and sent it to Marcellus's son. But on the way, a party of Numidians fell in with the men who were escorting the urn. They tried to seize it by force, and when the others resisted, they fought, and in a struggle the ashes were scattered far and wide. When Hannibal heard this, he remarked, "I might have known that nothing can be done against the will of the gods." He ordered the Numidians to be punished, but made no further effort to collect or return the remains, since he evidently felt that the strange manner in which Marcellus had met his death and been denied a proper burial indicated that some divine purpose was at work. This, at any rate, is the account which we find in Cornelius Nepos and Valerius Maximus. But according to Livy and Augustus Caesar, the urn was returned to Marcellus's son and buried with splendid ceremony. Besides the monuments which Marcellus dedicated in Rome, there was a gymnasium at Catana in Sicily which bore his name, and statues and votive tablets from among the plunder of Syracuse were set up in the temple of the gods named the Cabiri in Samothrace, and in the temple of Athena at Lindos. On his statue there, according to Posidonius, the following epigram was inscribed: "Stranger, this man you behold was the guiding star of his country, Claudius Marcellus by name, born of a glorious line, 7 times consul. He led the armies of Rome into battle. Death and destruction he dealt to all who invaded his land." The author of these verses has counted his 2 proconsulates as well as his 5 consulates. His descendants continued to distinguish themselves down to the time of that Marcellus, the nephew of Augustus Caesar, whose parents were Caesar's sister Octavia and Gaius Marcellus. He died while he was holding the office of aedile at Rome, soon after he had married the emperor's daughter Julia. It was in his honor and to his memory that Octavia dedicated a library and Augustus built a theater, both of which bear his name to this day.